big organizations. Sorry, I forgot to start recording this. Oh no, I'm recording already. And he's gonna talk to us about his book, The Unaccountability Machine: Why Big Systems Make Terrible Decisions and How the World Lost Its Mind. You know, we are surrounded by big machines, let's say, and it's good to hear a perspective of what they might imply about how society works. So thank you, Dan, for being here. You have about half an hour. Then Juan Pablo Torres, I don't know what is the exact name in English, but vicerrector no, vicedecano de posgrado, ¿no?
It's the associate dean. No
Yeah.
worries, you can introduce myself if you want.
Yeah, and he knows a lot about of organizations, so he's gonna discuss the book a little bit, and then we can open the floor for any questions that you have with Dan. So thank you, Dan, for being with us.
Well, thank you very much for doing me the honor of inviting me to this seminar series. My name's Dan Davies. I live in the southwest of England, and for the last kind of 10 years, I've been writing books on the fringes of economics. Before that, I was an investment banker for 15 years. That's one of the reasons why I'm just going to speak rather than presenting from slides, because when I left banking, I promised myself that I would never open up Microsoft PowerPoint again as long as I lived. And before that, I used to work at the Bank of England. Now, I was at the Bank of England during an interesting time in its history because I joined in the early 90s and left in the late 90s. And during that period, the Bank of England was given operational independence. And so that was a situation in which, you know, something happened which is considered normal in most of the world today. But when you think about it, it's actually quite strange. We had a democratic society in the United Kingdom decided that it was going to take something which for most of the previous century had been considered an absolutely fundamental role of government, setting the interest rates and setting the foreign exchange and exchange rate policy. And it was going to hand these responsibilities over to an institution that was specifically outside the field of politics. And I think it's worth kind of taking a couple of seconds to think what a strange thing that is, and maybe to go on and think about some of the consequences of that. So anyway, as I was kind of saying to my hosts when we were just kind of setting up the arrangements for this webinar, it's a long time since I was at the Bank of England. Me and the Bank of England can no longer blame each other for our problems, I think. And I certainly don't speak for them or really maintain much contact apart from going to the occasional alumni association meetings. But I think it's fair to say that for the first decade of the Bank of England's independence, it looked like a massive success story, you know, and this was true the whole world over, wherever you had independent central banks. For the early 2000s, it looked like, despite, you know, some very significant economic turbulence, you know, we had the Russian near defaults, we had the Asian crisis, we had the dot-com bust, and the economies of the industrialized world looked like they were doing incredibly well. And you can actually see this if you look at charts, or if you go to a library and dig up a central bank annual bulletin from any of those years, they're very much congratulating themselves on how well they were managing the economy, how they were keeping both inflation and the volatility of inflation to very low levels, and GDP growth was continuing to come in. And then 2007, 2008 happened, and that marks a big break in a lot of people's understanding of the world, because for the previous decade, everyone had presumed that the economy was in the hands of wise, benign technocrats. And suddenly we got all of these stories, and it turned out that the economy was in the hands of people who were perhaps not as wise as they'd appeared, and who were not perhaps as advanced in their technical understanding of the systems that they were meant to be managing. And at that point, things became tough. You know, in the UK, maybe less so. In the European Union, or particularly in the Eurozone, things pretty much nearly broke down. There was times, and I was on an investment bank trading desk in 2011-12, during the Euro crisis, the Greek default, the Irish, Portuguese, and even Spanish near defaults. And there were times at which it genuinely looked like the consensus in favor of the European single currency and the whole European Union was in danger of breaking down. And I think a big reason for that is that it is kind of psychologically intolerable to people and politically intolerable to be the subject of decisions for which there is no accountability. Now, it is extremely, difficult, we know in our personal life, to deal with someone who won't listen to you. And it's even more intolerable politically to feel like you are in a situation where nothing you say makes any difference. And that's why I ended up kind of several years later, after a lot of research, writing a book about this phenomenon of the general erosion of accountability, in the modern world. I'll let you into kind of the background of this. The book I wanted to write, and the book which I would have delivered at least a year earlier to my publisher if I had been able to write it, was just going to be a straightforward polemic, kind of saying, here we have everything from customer service and the internet to chatbots to the education system to central banks. Everyone's running away from accountability. Aren't these people awful? Aren't these people, bad for creating systems that let them avoid listening to people from outside and let them avoid taking accountability for their decisions? And that book would have been really easy to write, and it might have sold better than the book that I actually did write. But I think that would not have been an intellectually honest thing to say. Because when you start looking into why people create these systems which break the link of accountability from their decisions, you end up realizing that you actually kind of have to sympathize with them for the most part. Because what everyone's doing is they're trying to deal with one of the fundamental problems of management and administration, which is of being overwhelmed by complexity. When human beings are overwhelmed by complexity, what they do is they build systems to help them manage that complexity. They build sets of rules, they build models of the world, and what you effectively do is you create a mental object in your head. You make decisions about your simplified mental object, and then you hope that when you apply those decisions to the real world, the consequences aren't going to be too disastrous. And this is a good thing, not a bad thing. It means that we can operate on a shared basis. It means that we can work together. It's basically an expression of our capability as human beings for abstract thought. The problem becomes because scale matters. And so if I was asked, as I was in fact asked by the publicity department of my publishing company, to say what my book is about in a single phrase, I would say it's about the industrialization of decision making. And the way I would kind of unpack that concept is to say that it matters a lot when you industrialize a process. As everyone's understood from the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Even Karl Marx was writing about this in the 1830s. The nature and purpose of industrialization is that it breaks the link between the individual worker and their product. So someone in Sheffield in 1832 making cutlery in a factory can point to a knife and a fork and say, I made that. Someone operating a automated steel pressing machine in the same factory 100 years later, they no longer can say they made that. They didn't make that. The machine made that, and they operated the machine. But as industrial society became more complex, we started to industrialize the decision-making processes too. So we started bringing in systems for the management of our organizations as well as for the production of their physical output. Sometimes when I talk about systems, I'm talking about literal computers, algorithms, and things you can run on a machine. Sometimes it's more a question of policies, hierarchies, management systems, organograms. Even double entry bookkeeping is in its own way a way of representing information and creating decisions. When you turn the managers and leaders of an organization into the operators of an industrialized decision-making machine, you shouldn't be surprised that the same thing happens. They no longer feel that same connection between them and the output of the decision-making machine. And if you feel like you didn't make a decision and you can't change the outcome, then it's very hard to feel like you're accountable for that decision. You have a very great incentive to try and break those links of accountability, because it's just impossible to be held accountable for a decision that you don't feel that you made and that you can't change. And so that's kind of my view of the fundamental problem that we're reaching, as in the industrial world at this time. We have a situation in which it's clear that very bad consequences are resulting from the breakdown of accountability, but we can't kind of put the accountability back in the system in any straightforward way, because we can't turn the clock back on complexity. And that's a tough question to have to consider. It took me a long time to think about this, and I had to basically unlearn most of my training as an economist, because the interesting thing here is that these are all problems of management, complexity, and information. And economics, in the way I learned it at a British university and a British business school, doesn't really deal with information in that kind of way. Most standard economic models will either assume perfect information or have no need to even consider information because they're just talking about price and quantity, or they'll be really tricky, really specialized game theory models that you can really only apply to one problem at a time and certainly can't apply to a whole interconnected system. So I started thinking, well, that means I'm going to have to go back to the books. I'm going to have to start looking at who it is who has ever thought about complexity and information. And that takes you to the management science literature, I'm afraid. And the management science literature it's not in a great state, in my view. There's a lot of management science which is quite thin, quite unrigorous, kind of quite general and full of cliches. But there's one book of management science which everybody likes, which is recommended by economists, political scientists, and everyone. It's one of the great classics, and I could recommend everyone to read it, which is Structure and Strategy by Alfred Chandler. And Alfred Chandler was a historian by training, and he did exactly what you want someone to do when they're studying management, which is that he had access to all of the important board minutes of some of America's biggest companies, DuPont, General Motors, General Electric, during one of the most interesting times in their development, immediately after the Second World War, when these companies were expanding at an incredible rate and getting more complex as they do so. And, you know, I don't want to kind of pretend that I'm giving spoilers for structure and strategy here. I don't want to kind of discourage anyone from reading it, because every single page of that book is worth reading. But the way I'd summarize Chandler's ideas is that there's a kind of law of motion here. Organizations grow if they are healthy. As they grow, they become more complicated. As they become more complicated, managing them takes up more and more resources. At some point, it becomes impossible or not economically viable to add management resources at a fast enough rate to keep up with the complexity of the organization, at which point they reorganize. And that's kind of a law of motion that keeps on kind of happening. If they don't reorganize, they blow up. And you can see this is why structure is determined by strategy, which in turn is the way of dealing with growth and complexity. And what interests me there is that this is somewhere where you can see how applied mathematics could become relevant, because you ask, why do things get more complicated as they grow? Easiest way to think about that is to pick up another absolute classic of management literature, one of the books that computer scientists will always recommend, called The Mythical Man Month, by a guy called Fred Brooks, who was a head engineer at IBM when they were building, you know, the first mainframe computers. And Fred Brooks pointed out that adding more personnel to a late project will usually make it later, because the amount of complexity and overhead of a network grows as the square of people involved, because each person adds a set of connections to everyone who's already in the organization, while the amount of resource able to deal with that complexity scales linearly with the number of people involved in it. So there you've got a kind of law of motion that explains why, as things grow bigger, they inevitably become unmanageable. What then really interested me, though, is when a great friend, colleague, and mentor who's unfortunately no longer alive, a guy called Sebastian Noakes, told me that there was a whole science dedicated to dealing with this, and it too came out of Second World War work and applied mathematics. It was called, well, it's interesting, the names here. The name that I talk about in my book for this science is cybernetics, because that was the title of the original book by Norbert Wiener, who had worked on the invention of the automatic gun sights in kind of 1940s, and who realized while designing that gun sight that there was some quantity kind of preserved between the radar, the operator, the servo motors, and the barrel of the gun, and that quantity was information, and that it could be dealt with, you know, mathematically, basically as being related to the thermodynamic concept of entropy. It's more commonly known as information theory, and more commonly attributed to Claude Shannon of Bell Labs. And there's an interesting kind of dual there. There's a deep correspondence with these things. Shannon's information theory is the basis of telecommunications, the basis of modern electronic computing, and, you know, it's very well known. But of course, the theory of information processing is the theory of control. You know, the capacity of a communications channel to carry a message of kind of a given degree of complexity is also the same mathematics that describes the capacity of a regulatory system to manage a system of given complexity. And This deep correspondence is really interesting because it means that we can think about management and complex systems using the same applied mathematics of information theory, which will be great news, except unfortunately it's not true. The trouble here is that one of the ways in which the original management scientists using cybernetics and information theory failed is that they tried to act as if they had full information about a system when they did not. Someone told me at a conference earlier in this year that Wiener's cybernetics made a huge impact in communist China in the 1950s, because people thought, you know, this is great. This is a book that's telling us about control, forecasting, and we can apply this to the, you know, management of the whole of China. And so they got one of the best engineers in China, a guy who just finished kind of work on the first Chinese kind of mainframe computer project, and they assigned him to using applied mathematics to forecast and manage the Chinese economy and political system. And the first thing he did was plugged in some equations about population growth, sat in a room looking at lines relating population growth and food production, and came out with the one-child policy in China. You know, and the trouble here is that if you start applying mathematics and applying kind of scientific methods to managing complex systems, you quickly run away and end up doing something stupid, because every regulatory system is implicitly a model. You know, when you're making a rule book, you're also making a model of the world. It's one of these mental objects. If that model fails to represent something in reality, then sooner or later it's going to drift away from reality. Your decisions about your imaginary object are not going to correspond to the real world, and sooner or later, you know, you're going to make mistakes like, you know, all of those anecdotes of all of the things that went wrong in China under Mao. And so the cyberneticians kind of went back to deal with this problem and realized they had to kind of apply the system to itself, create what they called second order cybernetics, which was respecting the fact that you don't have enough information to make a perfect mathematical model of anything. And you never will, because, you know, it's just impossible to kind of quantify all of the things that you're going to know. And even if you were at one moment to quantify everything, in a short period of time, the world's going to change and more information from outside the system is going to be relevant. So you have to move, as one of my friends says, from math to metaphor. And so you start saying, what things can we say about information theory without ever having to quantify our information in terms of like a number of megabytes per second? And it turns out there's quite a lot you can do with this. One thing you can say is that for a system to remain regulated, the capacity of the regulator to process information has to be at least as great as the variety and volatility of the system that it is managing. How do you know whether that's happening? Well, you know, we've all seen someone who's overwhelmed by information. We've all seen an organization that is unable to cope with the complexity of what it's managing. Things get into distress when they haven't got spare information managing capability. You know, at that point, something from outside the system needs to observe them. And it's quite a deep insight to say that what they need to bring in is either more information processing capacity to the management system, or something that's going to simplify and reduce the volatility of the system under management. Another thing you can say from information theory is that big problems happen at boundaries. When information has to be transmitted from one place to another, you need to pay attention to ensure that that information is being transmitted in a form in which it can be the basis for decisions being made at the other end. And one particular kind of important special case of that is that information has to arrive in time to be the subject of decisions. You know, when you're designing a management system, you have to design the communications, you have to design the translation between one form of information and another, and you have to ensure that signals can be dealt with and processed at a sufficient speed to be relevant to the decisions that they're going to make at another point. But probably one of the most important insights is that systems are recursive. You know, the big theorems of cybernetics are always emphasizing that one small system is embedded in a larger system, and a larger system is made up of smaller subsystems. Because you have problems at the boundaries, that means that you need to pay special attention to links between the lowest level of the hierarchy and the highest level. You need to have emergency red handle systems. I mean, the example that I give in the book is literally of the red handle in the cabin of a train. That's the emergency brake. It stops one train. But the interesting thing to me is that the red handle is also an organizational tool, because when someone pulls the red handle, they also rewrite the train timetable for that day. An individual driver is not usually allowed to rewrite the whole timetable. What they're doing when they pull that red handle is, as well as physically stopping the train and preventing it from hitting something, they are communicating to all levels of the railway hierarchy that something has happened which was not anticipated in the design of that day's rail timetable. The thing which has happened is going to create physical consequences that are intolerable to the system, and so everyone responsible for that needs to drop their current projects and devote their management capacity to working out how to deal with the fact that one of their fundamental assumptions is no longer satisfied. And that brings me back kind of full circle to the points that I was trying to make in the book, because I think that what we are missing in the kind of systems of things that I've referred to as the unaccountability machine is exactly those links between the bottom levels of the hierarchy and the top levels of the hierarchy. We need to, in many ways, give up on the concept of accountability as we knew it kind of 200 years ago, or back in the times of the Bible, or back in the times of the kind of medieval legends. It's not appropriate to an industrial age. But what's bad about accountability is that it is a design flaw in the information circuits of a complex system. When people create accountability barriers, unaccountability machines, what they are doing is breaking a feedback link from the subjects at the lower levels of the system, the people who the decisions affect, and making it impossible for problems at that level of the system to be communicated, or at least to be communicated in time and in a form where they can be the basis for action to the higher levels of the system. And that's something which I think can be shown to be just kind of scientifically wrong. It's breaking clear principles of information engineering. I think that's what's intolerable about it. And so, you know, kind of the message of the book is that if we design our systems more consciously in the knowledge that we're designing information processing systems, we will always be minded to keep those feedback links coming from the bottom level to the top. I've kind of reached the bottom page of my notes here, but also I think I need to practice what I preach, because I've now reached the point at which I think it's time for me to get some feedback from the people, on the receiving end of this system of me talking to you.
Thank you, Dan. That was perfect. Juan Paulo?
Yes, well, I have the difficult task to discuss this interesting your interesting book and your interesting conversation as well. Briefly, I have some notes that I would like to share with you. Well, firstly, I'm really delighted, to be honest, for discussing this book. Challenge our understanding of economy, business, and society. But before diving to some details, let me ask you a question for the audience. Have you ever come across a book that that changed the way you see the big system? I think that the Unaccountability Machine aims to do. It's a book that challenges, inspires, and invites us to think in why big systems make terrible decisions and how the world lost its mind. It's very interesting, this book, written by Dan Davies, with some themes that include a lack of accountability in various modern institutions, from government agencies to large corporations and financial systems. In fact, Dan argues that these organizations often operate in ways that shield them from responsibility, allowing them to make decisions without facing the consequences of their actions. In fact, there is one quote that says, if your workplace is a small or medium-sized company with no conflict of interest among its owners, you might be able to understand or predict its activities. If it's any larger or more complicated, you will go crazy trying. It's true. This book also delves into how the lack of accountability arises, examining structural issues, cultural norms, and the complexities of bureaucracy that contribute to an environment where individuals and entities can evade blame. Dan said, the law. Let me explain this example that is very interesting to give a good point here. He talked about the common law of England and Wales, and he said in some quote, the law absolutely fits the definition of an accountability sink. It's a system which is meant to provide decisions that are not attributable to an identifiable person and which are not alterable in response to feedback from those affected by them. And he said, you cannot argue with a judge. Do you think the audience, agree with this idea about that? When you analyze the book, he starts saying, but that is not the end of the story. It's not a complete accountability sink, and the feedback link isn't completely broken. The law is made up mainly of precedent rather than statute, and its development takes place by a kind of feedback mechanism. Of course, I agree that the precedents are more or less influential depending the seniority and the reputation of the judges who made those rulings, he said. But I think here we have some ideas behind this, because what happens when the promotion of such judges, like in Chile, are influenced by a particular person, like a lawyer or a group of people? This book is a call to action for more transparency, better regulation, and cultural toward a genuine accountability. Let me explain two ideas that I really like to say. The first idea is that the book is a clear exposition of how the complex organization structures can obscure lines of accountability. Dan argues that the bureaucracy, while necessary for large-scale operation and corporation, can become a tool for obfuscation, making it difficult to pinpoint where decisions are made and who should be held responsible for failures. This analysis is particularly relevant for Latin American businesses, many of which operate in environments with weak regulatory oversight and limited transparency. One of the strengths of this book it's also the use of diverse case studies, including, for the audience, page 53, in which there is a section that is called The Road to Chile. This section captured me not merely because it focused on Chile, but because it highlights an extraordinary project, or at least an interesting project, led by Stafford Beard, a British consultant, that developed a project with Corfo, our Corfo in Chile, between 1971 and 1973. It's interesting because even though this project, perhaps you have checked it, that is called the Allende's Internet, or the project CyberSync, I think that is the name in English, was to try to implement a pilot system in the organization of the state or the government. It's very interesting. In fact, you can see some detailed explanation about the foundation of this experience in page 117. What I found particularly compelling is how Dan draws on the concept from system theory and cybernetics, the later famous defined by Norbert Wiener as the study of the control and communication in the animal and the machines. However, the Unaccountability Machines book is not without some limitation that I try to take, but it's more limitation for the Latin American audience, to be honest, Dan. Okay. While you provide from Western institutions, the book could be benefit from a more global perspective, including a specific example from Latin Americans. I'll say Latin American because it is the context. Because Latin American businesses operate in a unique socioeconomic and political context, often characterized by higher levels of informality, different legal frameworks, and distinctive cultural attitudes toward authority and accountability. Finally, and I think that the Unaccountability Machine offers several valuable lessons for Latin American business and society. First, it underscored the importance of cultivating a culture of accountability within organizations. This can be achieved by clearly defining roles and responsibility, implementing robust internal control. There's some regulation right now in Chile and Latin America that are trying to push companies to that. Fostering an environment where ethical behavior is rewarded and unethical behavior is not punished, but is addressed. For businesses operating in a region where trust in institutions is often low, I think that there is some good and valuable insight from the book on how to tackle in this institution. Lastly, I enjoy a lot reading this book, and I think that this book serves as a reminder of the value of external accountability mechanisms, specifically in regions like our region, Latin America, where public institutions may be perceived as ineffective or, in some cases, corrupt, to be honest. Business should consider alternative forms of oversight, such as third-party audits, industry certification, or engagement with civil society organizations. I think that this mechanism can provide an additional level of accountability and help to build trust with customer, investors, and the broader community. So this was I tried to summarize some ideas. I think that your book opened my mind to develop other ideas, but at least this is like a summary of some interesting point that I got from the book. Bernardo.
Thank you, Juan Pablo. So just we're open. We can open the floor. You can write the questions in the chat or in the Q&A. By the way, we have the book available in the library of the university. If you want to take a look, we have like 3 copies, I think. And oh, you cannot see it. You have to. But we have more than a copy, and I remember I left you one in your desk. So, so if someone might want to write something, I will ask. Like I'm an economist. I'm right now not in Santiago because I was in a meeting of economists, and one of the subjects that show up is the problem of local governments. That in Latin America, we're very centralized countries in general, more than developed countries, and Chile in particular is a very centralized country. So I don't know, have you seen this? Like, because it obviously it makes it like the authorities are farther and farther away, right? The system is bigger and bigger and bigger. Do you have thoughts about that kind of phenomenon?
Well, I mean, really, and I think Juan Pablo is absolutely correct that one weakness in the book is that it's very concentrated on the kind of UK, US, European sort of system that I'm most familiar with. There's nothing in there about Asia either, which is something that I really wished I'd had time to do. One of the reasons in particular that I didn't write much about Chile, which is a quite controversial choice in a book about cybernetics and Stafford Beer.
Did he freeze or no? Yeah.
Uf.
Ah, se pegó.
Mm.
Hay que darle feedback a la compañía de internet. Can you listen to us, Dan? Well, this happens. Si quieren hacer una pregunta, puede ser en español, ¿ah? Y la escriben, o si directamente la pueden escribir en inglés, me da igual. Yo igual como que la sintetizo un poquito. Vamos a esperar un poco, si no. Bueno,
Pues,
sí, ya se,
tenemos-
se cayó. Voy a esperar a ver si vuelve. Pero aprovechen de escribir sus preguntas a aquellos que quieran hacer algo. Preguntar algo. Oye, está entretenido el libro, por eso yo lo elegí. Dicen que es muy entretenido.
verdad que les recomiendo a todos leerlo, porque tiene una perspectiva bien distinta, aborda desde muchos puntos de vista, no solamente el punto de vista clásico de economía. Y lo más interesante es que, si bien, como dije en la crítica, está muy centrada, por decir, en Inglaterra, Europa, eh, hay hartos aprendizajes de lo que nos está pasando hoy día en Chile, como el lack of accountability. Que
Claro,
tenemos hoy día.
accountability, el ejemplo que pone en el libro, si no mal recuerdo, es, por ejemplo, cambian algo en tu aerolínea. Y obviamente uno quiere o sea, el que sufre el impacto eres tú, y el que tomó la decisión de hacer algo con la aerolínea, hay una desconexión, lo que llama él un accountability sink. Entonces ponen una persona que su único trabajo es como de tener que pueda ser informado de que cometieron el error con tu vuelo, una cosa así. Entonces, como que si uno mira eso entendí, las organizaciones grandes están llenas de como estas personas cuyo trabajo no es en realidad comunicar que pasó algo mal o qué sé yo, sino el trabajo fundamental es evitar que te que al jefe se le moleste, una cosa así, ¿no? Que va, bueno, lo típico es la secretaria, ¿no? Porque a la secretaria le dicen, oye, contiene porque eh, si no me van a venir a molestar. Aquí está, lo voy a promover de nuevo, ahí entro de nuevo. Esperemos que ahora sí pueda. Y yo creo que ahí cerramos, porque igual estamos medio
Sí,
apretados de tiempo. A ver, pero había entrado, y ahora se cayó de nuevo. Sorry, Dan, I'm trying to promote you as a panelist, but I don't see that it's happening. Ah, por cierto, todos los libros del webinar Galetovich están en la biblioteca, por si quieren visitar alguno. Sorry, Dan. Maybe I can. There. Declining to be promoted. Se cayó de nuevo.
No, it's over there.
Cosas que pasan. Pero debe haber sido una experiencia media traumatizante, parece. El Banco de Inglaterra, weón. Lo último y le dejamos responder por lo menos. There you are. I didn't see you that you were already a panelist, sorry. Let me give you host permission.
Yes, you have to.
Yeah. Espérate. Pero se fue, ¿no? ¿Por qué no lo veo yo? Can you talk, Dan? Do you listen to us? I think we can hear you, but I don't see you to promote you as a panelist. Qué raro. De nuevo. Ahí salió, si entra ahora. Si no, lo paramos acá nomás, no pasa nada.
Sí.
Si ya los puntos fundamentales ya fueron hechos. Última oportunidad. Me mando un mail, quizás. Bueno, no pasa nada, sino.
Sí, comentemos.
Bueno, no sé si quieres cerrar tú, Juan Pablo, así como en español, para que quizás, porque algunos quizás por el tema del lenguaje se perdieron un poco del libro. ¿Por qué hay que leerlo? Esa es la pregunta fundamental, ¿no?
A ver, yo creo que bien breve así, en un minuto, yo creo que para todo estudiante y también creo que para los profesionales es importante tener una visión crítica sobre el mundo. A veces siempre reclamamos, no, los sistemas funcionan mal, como que siempre la responsabilidad se lo atribuimos a un ente, a una conspiración, de incluso decía el libro, pero a veces nos damos cuenta que gran parte de esos problemas, algunos son una crítica de la misma estructura burocrática que lleva a que después no encontremos quién es el culpable. O sea, se nos cayó la electricidad, ¿quién es el culpable? ¿A quién puedo ir realmente y decir que se atribuye la responsabilidad? Entonces, el libro de Dan habla un poco de estos ejemplos. Habla de que a veces esto es parte de un sistema, o a veces incluso esos sistemas son creados. Entonces, hoy día, el gran punto de por qué creo que hay que leerlo es necesario que todos tengamos una visión hacia la transparencia. ¿Ya? Esto es clave. Lo estamos viendo en la política, lo estamos viendo en todos lados. Es como que nos estamos dando cuenta que parece que no éramos ese país tan así como libre de problemáticas de corrupción. Y una vez que tú te enteras de eso, tienes que crear sistemas, y de hecho al final lo quise decir lo dije en inglés, sistemas externos que no solamente te permiten auditar tu actividad en las empresas, sino que también en diferentes agrupaciones sociales o agrupaciones de personas. Entonces, da ejemplos, son buenos ejemplos porque gran parte de nuestras instituciones tienen tradiciones europeas, o sea, cómo funcionan los bancos centrales, etc. Y creo que es un muy buen documento que te permite como tener una reflexión y también sirve como un muy buen tema de conversación en una mesa intelectual. Así que eso, Eduardo.
Yo creo que un poquito el ejemplo de Luis Hermosilla es un poquito de eso. Él era un accountability sink. Los grandes sistemas contratan a alguien que eviten que los problemas, la responsabilidad, la accountability de las decisiones. Y nosotros también en las universidades cuando crecen empiezan a tener estos problemas.
No
Eso,
vamos a decir
muchas
más porque bueno, después me está haciendo de
gracias.
que
Por eso hay que trabajar
la
siempre, hay que tener a alguien bueno ahí acá. Ya, eso, muchas gracias por venir. Tengo la lista de todos los asistentes, así que se las voy a mandar a los profesores interesados. Muchas gracias, Juan Pablo, y bueno, lean el libro, de verdad es muy entretenido. Que estén bien.
Chao, chao.